people who are entering the space, anyone who goes into Web3 and understands what it means, it's much bigger than just the product. But when you actually understand what it stands for, when you understand the idea, the promise, the prospect, and the ability of it, then you don't care that much necessarily about the initial gloss and glean and what it looks like. And that's the metaverse, that's Web3. And once you're infected with this idea of economic freedom in the digital platforms, you never want to go back. What Web3 gaming does is not the fact that you must make money from it. It's the fact that it unleashes and transparently opens up the financial ecosystem of the gaming world.
You just demonstrated that close association between property rights, freedom of speech.
It is all tied. It is all tied. It is all tied. Politics are politics, but at the end of the day, politicians still have to listen to their people. And if their people want something that is maybe more connectedness and more compassion, then the politicians who advocate for this will be the ones who are elected. When you do the work that you do, think about the why and think about sort of why is it important. When you get to this point where you have the luxury and the ability to think about the greater things that you could do, the choices you make because of it, I think you will live a more fulfilling life. We need to find a way in which our younger children can learn about economics literally at the primary school level. And I think this is what excites me around Web3 and blockchain gaming. This is where children engage. They'll learn about this. If they don't learn it at school, learn it there. And that's what I'm really hopeful about where the world will go.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is...
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Yat Siu, the entrepreneur, investor, business leader, and gaming pioneer. You started your career at Atari Games at the tender age of 13 and went on to found the digital media development company Outblaze. In 2011, you co-founded Animoca, which provided gaming applications to the emerging smartphone market and has since become a world leader in entertainment, gamification, and blockchain innovation. Animoca Brands is now valued at close to $6 billion after your successful $110 million raise this year. You believe that GameFi represents the future and that NFTs offer a new way for culture to be stored in the digital world. Your plan is to build a global company with a big vision to deliver true digital property rights for all. You believe that NFT games are only scratching the surface of what's possible and that in the future, completely new gaming models will be developed as a result of digital ownership. Yat, welcome back to London Real.
Thank you. And that was an amazing introduction. We're going to have to use that every time.
I always tell people you are the guy to speak to about Web3, gaming, Metaverse, and the future. And honestly, when we spoke a year ago, it was remote because you were in Hong Kong, but I quite frankly didn't understand the Metaverse. And then after our conversation, I actually understood it. And I always tell all my students to watch that one interview because I think you break it down so people can kind of get their head around it. And we got so much to talk about. And I don't know where we start. You know, the last year since we spoke, so much has happened. And of course, the last couple of days, so much has happened.
Yes, indeed.
So where do we start? We're going to talk the last couple of days or are we going to talk about the last year?
Well, I mean, I think, let's address the elephant in the room, right? Last couple of days. And then let's talk about, I think what happened in the last year with NFTs and sort of gaming adoption is really a macro trend that I think, we're still just in the beginning of. I think the last, few days, obviously, for some people might be considered a little bit traumatic. But I think the very important thing to recognize is that it's a relatively smaller audience that has been affected by this.
Right.
In some ways, you could say that those affected by what happened to FTX are still the people who are generally trading, for instance, are people who are in the financial services side. Whereas when you think about what's happening with blockchain games, with the people who are engaging with culture, with non-fungible tokens, maybe there's some fluctuation in the value for sure, in terms of maybe volumes or in terms of perceived value. However, they didn't go there because of the trading aspect of it or because of the financial services aspect. They entered it because of culture, because of gaming, because of fun, because of entertainment, or because of art, for instance. And that's the long-term trend. In the last year and a half, most people entered blockchain because of NFTs. And it's not because it's the ownership of the NFT, it's because it represents culture, which is how most of us actually engage. We care about traditions, we care about art, we care about identity. But if you think about the history of blockchain, many of the very first generations of people that came in, even though it maybe didn't start this way, are people who came from Wall Street. And so it was very financial in nature. And so everyone measures it in financial ways when that's only one avenue of why digital property rights and blockchain is valuable, but it's not the only way. So on one hand, yes, it's tragic, and we hope things will balance out. And this year has been a tough year, starting from the first part of the year, with Terra, and then afterwards with Three Arrows, and now with FTX. But it's still the same audience, if I may say so, right? It's the same group of people that were affected. And I think also people are becoming more cautious. So maybe the main setback, I would say, is perhaps the reputational damage, right? I think certainly some of the investors in the space are going to be much more cautious on the financial services side, right? The exchange business, for instance, I think will be looked at with much more scrutiny. But that I don't think is affecting the gaming sector, because gaming is still the fastest growing business sector basically in the world right now when you compare it to other forms of entertainment. It's a $200+ billion industry. It's bigger than music and film combined. It covers the attention of 3.4 billion people and rising. So that is the audience that we're sort of generally targeting, plus of course other people in the online space. That is what matters. And most of them don't trade on Wall Street and they don't trade crypto.
Right. And so this, as tragic it is and difficult to digest, you're talking about 500,000 to 1 million people that were kind of trading on a platform that this affects. And again, the community knows these people and we meet them at conferences and that kind of thing. But if you want to zoom out and go to 30,000 feet, you're saying there's a lot of other things going on in this space.
Well, what's fascinating? I mean, just now as I'm attending Token 2049, while obviously there's a lot of shock and, debate and discussion, the mood isn't really like, oh my goodness, what am I doing here? This is the end of the world. I mean, people taking photos of, alpacas basically running around the conference, excited about opportunities, pitching still. And, yeah, maybe this is certainly not the best time to be trying to pitch to raise money because maybe there's some sensitivities. But the thing is, there's still an energy, right? People are still hopeful. And that was very different from 4 years ago. So it's not nearly as bad as I think people think it is, but it certainly has a macro effect that we have to see how it shakes out in the next week or two. But the energy is there. And I would say the same thing, when I went to Korea Blockchain Week, which was, I think it was maybe a month or two after what happened with Terra, and Terra basically being very sort of strong in Korea at the time. Obviously, many people in Korea were affected. The general commentary I got from a lot of people was, oh, don't bother going to Korea. Everyone's against it, it's bad, and so on. And certainly many people suffered, and that's really bad. But at the conference, the energy was electric. Everyone was like, yeah, that's bad, that's really bad, but we're here to build, we're excited. Many young people understand that was, where the future was going. This was the future they wanted to build. The true builders were emerging. So, I would say that it's a true test of strength, that no matter how hard you shake sort of the tree, it's still standing there.
Yeah, and I felt that energy yesterday as well. I mean, obviously people were talking about it, but, everybody was still buzzing and talking and moving. And, I get a feeling of crowds. I'm sure you do as well. And there wasn't this like ghost-faced, pale, yes, what are we going to do now thing. It was just everybody was getting on with it. And it was like, yeah, that kind of sucks. And we didn't see this happening. And, but, everybody's building.
Yes.
And continue to move on. That's a testament to the space.
Yes, exactly.
To finish up with the year in review, you mentioned Terra Luna. I guess we saw Celsius failing and Voyager. Like, what are some of the benchmarks to review them now? What your thoughts were on them? And then I'd love to talk about bigger picture.
Well, I mean, so first of all, I think when you look at the financial sector, right, when you think about what happened basically with those sort of financial service providers, they definitely suffered. And I think there will be probably a little bit more pain to come from them because there is going to be a contagion because they typically do business with each other, right? It's a sort of a network effect of a different kind. But the other stat we should basically look at for this year is, what went into Web3 investments. Billions of dollars just in Web3 gaming investments in these last 3 quarters, over $3 billion. And the entire space itself, I think, was, maybe even double that in the area of Web3. And we're not talking about just the first half year. We're talking about even just the last quarter. I think it was just $1.8 billion invested in the space. Now, obviously, it's not, it maybe wasn't how it was, at the end of last year, but that's a pretty healthy investment figure, right? So that's one of the sort of, I would say, look at the optimism that we see with the investment community as well as the community at large. Take a look at, for instance, what happened when NFTs were dropped to the Reddit community and what that did for interested people in the adoption. This is the year in which ApeCoin, for instance, launched as well, which was, and many of sort of really fascinating sort of blockchain games came out. So that's exciting. And then on the policy side as well, places like Hong Kong, which always was viewed in the past as, is it kind of like a policy like China? Are they anti-crypto? Has come up with a sort of virtual asset regime, embracing basically digital assets, talking about the fact that retail should be able to trade crypto, for instance, right? I mean, that's a big, big change, right? And then more importantly, when I was having dinner at the end of the sort of session with the the Secretary for Financial Services, a minister in Hong Kong, Secretary of Financial Services in the Treasury, he showed up in a punk outfit. So of course I had to match it with my Bored Ape outfit, both from Vivienne Tam, who is a Hong Kong fashion designer making NFT-based fashion, right? But she's a global fashion icon, right? So and she showed that in, for instance, New York Fashion Week. So it's almost like you have 2 parallel worlds, right? Where you have one area where the world of sort of, let's call it, metaverse, blockchain, Web3 culture, despite everything, is continuing to rock, is continuing to go really sort of, full on. And yes, the markets are sort of, volatile, but, they're soldiering on and they're super excited about it. And then, of course, you have a little bit on the sort of, let's say, pure financial side, maybe some people who are, of course, concerned. But one thing it definitely proves once more is actually, the decentralized platforms are fine. It's the centralized platforms that failed. The centralized platforms need to basically be watched over differently, clearly, as we have seen, because we can't see what's going on. Whereas the decentralized ones are transparent, they're open, you see everything, and therefore you can have more trust in those systems. So I think there is a silver lining around people understanding self-custody much more, around people understanding the value, or at least managing their risk differently, and appreciating actually what the value of true decentralization really is.
Yeah, I remember a few months ago when Celsius failed, Dan Moorhead from Pantera Capital, who's been on the show, wrote an article that basically said DeFi worked.
That's right.
Look what it worked. And it was funny because you could see Celsius trying to liquidate some of their positions and all the DeFi protocols were working. They were pieces of computer code that had collateral locked in, and you couldn't get it out unless you did the thing you were supposed to do. And that was the big message, although to the public it didn't work. But if you drove down, it was the centralized finance.
Correct.
And it's all the same things that happen when humans get involved with balance sheets where there's leverage. And this has happened in the financial industry for centuries.
Yes.
And it just happened again in
Yes.
the last 2 days. And it happened a few times before. So you're right, DeFi worked, and maybe we're getting proven these lessons. Like putting your hand on the stove sometimes, that's just showing you, okay, custody lessons, DeFi lessons as well. And we have to learn going forward.
Yes, absolutely.
You mentioned the thing about Hong Kong, and I just want to spend a little more time on it because I think it's important. First of all, you're a Hong Kong native. You love, well, not native, I mean, you obviously grew up in Austria, but you call it your home.
It's my home, yes.
You're a Hong Konger, I would say.
That's right, yes.
And you guys are an interesting lot. You guys stick together. You're a real specific type of person. But talk to me about this policy because, we'd heard a couple years ago that China was banning crypto, and now they've come out with this very kind of like pro-crypto, area for Hong Kong to move forward. And everyone's like, wait a second, is this right? I just saw the latest conference for the Communist Party where it seems as if they're going away from some of the capitalistic ideas. And I'm trying to get this in my head. So you're on the ground. What's really happening?
Well, I think one of the things that most people don't appreciate is that Hong Kong has always been this very liberal capitalist environment where if you think about it historically, it's always been the trade center really in and out of, for China. It's still the only place in which you can do renminbi, for instance, exchanges. It's a place where you can do certain kind of global financial instruments and free sort of movement of money that you can't do in China. So Hong Kong has always served this role. One of the problems that we've had really for Hong Kong, sadly, for the last couple of years is COVID. And because Hong Kong basically took a very aggressive COVID policy, people can't come to Hong Kong to see what's real and what isn't. And so the only thing you can do is see what the media is saying. And in the last couple of years, I think the media has been somewhat unkind to Hong Kong and sort of created the association that Hong Kong is China. And while, of course, Hong Kong is a part of China, it is still a separate place. It has its own laws. I can get the BBC, right? I can do all the things that we can do in the free world. And that includes crypto. Now, the difference about sort of digital assets before is there wasn't a policy direction for a while. And so people simply assumed that whatever the policy you have in China must therefore also be in Hong Kong. And this completely sort of demonstrates that that's not the case. And in fact, Hong Kong was never this point, never like this anyway. The exciting thing is that Hong Kong has basically demonstrated that they want to have virtual asset leadership. I think that's exciting for a couple of reasons. One, that we have a new global financial player that's basically saying, we're here to make this space better. We are invested in space. And you should have seen the conference. I was there basically opening it up with, the first fireside chat was between me and the Secretary of Financial Services and Treasury. And we talked about sort of what that meant for Hong Kong. The room was packed, right? It was electric. The excitement was there. Everyone was really wow, Hong Kong is embracing the future. And it was really kind of Hong Kong is ready for business. And for me, living in Hong Kong, it was very beautiful to see as well, because Hong Kong was being unfairly crushed, by other factors, including sort of media perceptions. And now you can come to Hong Kong, right, and then see it for yourself, but also benefit from these new policies that they're engaging. They've also come out, for instance, with this sort of quasi-sovereign fund, which again is a very on-Hong Kong thing, but they're like, hey, we want to kickstart the industry. If you're from overseas and you're building this new area of business that's developing, in the future of finance or fintech, for instance, Hong Kong has a fund available for you to look at that as well, right? So they're really sort of taking sort of a very proactive stance. I also think that it's going to have repercussions globally, right? In the sense that for a long time, well, I think we can make a safe assumption that Hong Kong probably didn't do this without some sort of blessing, right? I mean, they don't just make policies by themselves, which means that there is a macro perspective here around the fact that this is the way in which I think China is sort of experimenting and understanding, in this financial laboratory that Hong Kong always was for the region, which is a message for the rest of the world. Because if China is now playing with this in a way, then how should other places react to it? Are you willing to basically sort of just let sort of Hong Kong play in this part? Or do you want to actually also make sure that that talent that is basically the future of finance and maybe the future of the web as a whole, is something that we need to be globally active in, and which I think is going to be a positive thing. But Asia has been leading in this space from a regulatory standpoint this year as well. When we talk about this year, for instance, Japan, right? Prime Minister Kishida-san made Web3 in the Metaverse national agenda about 3-4 months ago. We announced sort of a partnership where Mitsubishi Group, Mitsubishi Bank basically made an investment in Animoca Japan, for instance. But, aside from the fact that you have, basically Japan's biggest bank may sort of invest in us in Japan for building Web3, is very much an indication where, as a nation, they want to go, right? And I think this also is really exciting. So the region is waking up to this. And I think the rest of the world, especially America, which I think leads from the innovation entrepreneurship side, but maybe on the regulatory side and maybe on the government side, is still a little uncertain about what to do, is now probably having to react to this, which I think is good, because we need some global competition. We need some other forces that can help shape the market.
So this is your message to Washington, D.C.
Well,
they should pay attention to what's happening in Hong Kong.
Well, I mean, I think that generally speaking, there is a lot of people in, I think, the U.S., especially in politics as well, who do want to see this develop, right? So it's not fair to say that, American politics is against it. But there's definitely division around it, which is very clear, right? And I think one of the things to think about is, what do they, the lesson is, well, why is Japan focusing on this? Why is Hong Kong, or, maybe by definition, China, for instance, looking at this? Why do they think it's important? Maybe what are we not seeing that we should understand better? I think that is the message here, because, we all recognize that there's different perspectives that have great value to each other.
And so does something happen in Hong Kong without China knowing about it or being involved?
Well, I mean, certainly many things would happen in Hong Kong without sort of, China knowing about it. But when it comes to financial policy, when it comes to regulatory policy, I do find it, again, I have no confirmation of this, but I do find it very difficult to believe that this wasn't done with any kind of appropriate consultation, because after all, this has a big effect, I think, on the direction of where Hong Kong is going to go.
Right. And I might ask my friends down the road here in Parliament here in London to also open their eyes to that.
Well, I mean, your new Prime Minister
Yeah.
appears to be, at least historically, very positive towards this, which I think is also interesting. And I think the UK, I think from a legal perspective, is now actually, I was reading somewhere that they were really looking at digital property rights as something, to look at from a legal perspective, which before they haven't considered. So I am, it is beginning, right? And so I'm actually quite hopeful about this. And I think these are the kind of developments that have happened this year that really isn't spoken about much, because we're all focused on the blow-ups, right? We're all focused on sort of what the drama of what's happening in sort of, what happened to SPF or what happened to Three Arrows. But actually, the inner workings of the stuff that's laying the groundwork, the policy work, the fact that governments are pushing this, for instance, that's not spoken about enough, but that's the real powerful stuff. Because at the end of the day, the stuff that we're reading in the media only, affects a small percentage, a small population of the world. What will affect, the rest of the world in a big way is policy.
Right. Yeah, and you're right. Rishi Sunak is traditionally pro-crypto. The UK, which has traditionally lagged a bit in major blockchain developers being located here. We've got Aave. You guys, Animoca, just opened up an office here, which is great.
We just announced it yesterday. Had an opening.
Yeah, congratulations on that. Welcome.
Thank you.
We welcome you here.
Yes. And we love it here.
Yeah, it's a great place to be. Obviously, a traditional financial capital. Great history. Does Brexit hurt us when it comes to bringing talent in there? We'll see. Hopefully we continue bringing talent, but I always worry about that. So that's good to see. Let's just mention, while we're on DC for now, you've probably watched the American policy change a lot, even in the last few years. And people argue now that the next presidential candidate will probably be pro-crypto, and that now to run for office in America, it's probably smarter to be pro-crypto, because they've kind of looked at the audience, and most people, would rather have a candidate that is pro-crypto. It's the best way to get elected. Now, I ran for mayor of London here in 2021, and I realized that all candidates care about two things: votes and money. And if they believe that the people really want that, it seems like they might change policies. Now, that might contrast with Gary Gensler, who is in the SEC, who's an appointed position, but also that can change over time. And so I was just curious about your perspective of policy in America, where it might be going.
So I think the policy aspect in America, at least from our own observation, relates a little bit to sort of where the sentiment lies. I think less about crypto, although crypto is part of the narrative, but more about capitalism. So my perspective as to what's happening in America is a little bit sort of this war on capitalism between, let's say, the younger generation versus the older generation, who very much sort of are, let's call it, thinking about sort of, the elements of, why capitalism is important, the property rights and the freedom aspect, and related to sort of, I guess, the meaning behind, why we basically need to have, I guess, relatively smaller government and perhaps, less controls, as an example. Whereas I think, the recent study, and actually studies in the last couple of years, have revealed that, I think most Americans under the age of, I think it was 30, actually are socialist leaning. And this idea that Americans could even talk about socialism 10 years ago would have just, probably had you kicked out of the country, right? Yeah. And now it's a political movement, and it's not just culminated or actually developed things like Bernie Sanders, who are all, by the way, well-meaning, right? The whole point is that they see a problem. Right? Young people don't really have an opportunity in America the way that they sort of their parents' generation had, for instance. The opportunity wasn't there. So capitalism hasn't worked for them. So the consequence, therefore, is that when we think about the backlash that we see this, for instance, in gaming, sort of non-fungible tokens and sort of, I guess, blockchain in gaming is very much popular in Asia, right? I mean, all the Korean and even Japanese game companies in Southeast Asia are all embracing it right now and saying this is the future and building towards it. Obviously we're in Hong Kong, but we're a global business and we can see the numbers grow. Whereas in America, if you remember last year, big gaming companies like EA were like, NFTs and blockchain, that's really interesting. And then, a big vocal minority of gamers were like lashing against it. Our feeling is that this isn't so much about, this fear of sort of introducing a new technology as much as it's a fear of introducing capitalism, which hasn't worked for them in the real life, basically into the digital world, which is basically where most of their time and attention is, where they actually have, where their society is, where their friends are, and where they aren't judged necessarily by how much money they have, because that is what is happening in the real world. Mm-hmm. And I think this anti-capitalist movement that we're seeing in America is, what is crypto? Crypto is digital capitalism as far as they're concerned. So digital capitalism, like Bitcoin, and the crypto bros is all bad, and non-fungible tokens is just covered basically in that whole area because they think that, it's like thinking that, every NFT is like a Lamborghini to the car industry, right? Like if you buy a car, it must be a Lamborghini. Of course, we know that's not true, but from their perspective, that's what they're thinking. I say this sometimes, where I think the American dream is much more alive and well in Asia than it is in America. And it is somewhat tragic because the American dream is what people around the world aspire to. And I think this has a lot to do with the fact that basically Americans generally, the younger generation, are doing worse off, right? And I think this is the political climate. So when we talk about a pro-crypto, let's say, sort of politician emerging, it has to solve with it sort of, and has to explain why actually blockchain and crypto is beneficial for young people, why it becomes more financially inclusive, why it can create more equity. And we believe that very firmly, but with that comes a lesson in capitalism. With that comes a lesson in property rights, which is something that we also have to overcome as to people understand, oh, what does physical property mean? That's what this means in terms of the ability to have freedom to transact and to have actual economic freedom. Well, the same is true for digital freedom, right? Many of, we spoke about this in the last show, many of the people who use Instagram or even TikTok, right, or Facebook, for instance, don't actually understand that the data that they're using on these platforms has value, right? And actually that they're mining, literally strip mining your ideas and your time and your attention and make money from it.
Digital colonialism, you call it to me.
Digital colonialism.
Taking your data and selling it back to you.
Correct. And on top of that, we're now still in a kind of digital feudalism. And because they don't fully understand that, they're sort of railing against it in a different way, but they don't understand that actually, if I at least have the freedom to know what it's worth, then someone else can basically give me better value for it. And I think this is the point, right? Because Facebook derives so much value. Actually, all the platforms, even Apple and Google in their own ways derive so much value from our time and attention. Why don't they share some of that back to the people who are actually providing that service? And therein lies the big problem, right? Because the value that they're generating actually goes entirely into, of course, their balance sheets. And it doesn't even sit in America as an American corporation. It's like in Ireland or something, which has, been optimized for taxes. And while we understand from a corporate perspective why they would maybe do that, it actually is against the spirit because you're making money in America. How come you're not giving back to America, right? Just imagine if, Apple and Facebook took 1% of their balance sheet of cash and reinvested it in startups in America, what would happen to the ecosystems that they're trying to construct? It would be bigger than the biggest venture funds that we all talk about. It would be bigger than A16Z's fund or Sequoia and, Kleiner Perkins and these sort of incredible venture funds that are out there. They have that capacity to do so. It used to be that we would receive taxes and then those taxes would then go into social services, and that's not happening. So I think this is the problem about sort of where the classic form of capitalism, shareholder capitalism, has basically gone wrong and has disenfranchised all the new people emerging into the space, which is the young people, because they can't participate. And this is why Web3 is so exciting, because it really transfers what was a kind of shareholder capitalism words where the zero-sum outcome where only a small number of people would benefit into stakeholder capitalism. Because every time you own land, for instance, in Sandbox, you're not just a customer consumer, you're a customer owner. You now have a stake in its success. Whether it does well or not is maybe not the reason you purchase it, but you are a participating member in the society, in the culture that would be, for instance, Sandbox, or Phantom Galaxies, or Rev Racing. And that means that as that business grows, as that community grows, you actually own equity in the project in some form or fashion. Like if you own real estate in London, right, you benefit if London as an economy does better, if it becomes more wealthy, if there's more business activity, if the GDP grows. So right, it would be a good thing for you to be an owner of something in London as opposed to just simply a consumer. So I think that's where this will go. And I think when we're able to, or a politician arises that is really able to explain this to most youth, and just to be clear, many young people in America love this space, right? They're influencing their parents' generation to actually go in there. But there's a lot of people who don't understand this because of this whole anti-capitalist sentiment. But if we can help explain to them that actually this gives you more equity, this makes it more fair for you, you actually become a real stakeholder, an economic stakeholder in this community, then I think you can win them over. We need to find a politician that is able to explain that.
Yeah, so both of my grandparents, I think, basically went west and were either given land or bought land very cheaply because nobody wanted to go out there. It was literally wild. I think my grandpa had lost everything in the Oklahoma Dust Bowl, and he went out. And I remember I was in Arizona and my grandma drove by a field and she said, "You see that field?" She said, "Your grandpa pulled stumps out of the ground for 2 years before he could plant his crops." And you watched me not complain the rest of the day.
Yes.
And so they understood property rights because they knew if they owned that, then that's how they could live and build a business. And so that first early generations of America got it. Now, as we go a few generations more, people that maybe they haven't really felt capitalism or the property rights and how it's an important part of their livelihood. So they're starting to question that and say, why do we need this? And should we have more of a socialist or communist standpoint? And maybe we shouldn't own things and maybe we should vilify billionaires, et cetera. And so then when they look at crypto, they say, oh, you guys are just part of them.
Right.
You guys are trying to make the money. You got the billionaires that maybe aren't billionaires anymore, doing all these things, and the NFTs that are going for ridiculous amounts of money. And they say, oh, you're part of that capitalist crew. And I think what you're trying to say, Yat, is actually, no, we are bringing in a system that, because at the same time, those younger people forgot to own their data. So the Web2 companies came about when they were all coming up, and we just gave our data away for free because we didn't know any better.
Exactly.
Just like the old, colonial forces did, including the UK, when they would go to, say, Africa, they would give us all their resources away for free. Right. So they're in this worst of both worlds scenario where their digital data is given away for free. So you need to re-educate them and say, guess what? Web3 is the best way to combat both, to get ownership of your digital rights, to understand why that's important, but also to exercise democracy in the form of DAOs, et cetera.
Yeah. If you look at, for instance, the sort of my parents' generation, from Asia, for instance, right, Chinese immigrants, they had no property rights, literally in their generation. Right? These are people who basically fled the country for a reason. Of course, things are much better, and now you have respect to property rights in China. And really, think about that. Without property rights, China would not be the economic miracle that it is today. There's a very clear parallel, right? All countries that have, basically property rights do economically much better, significantly better than the countries that have none or sort of almost no property rights, right? This is an established sort of data point.
That's probably the most important point of this entire conversation.
Yes, well,
because if you can understand that and apply it to digital, that's everything you're all about and Animoca is all about.
Yes, correct. And the whole point on that is that then when you own the property, the freedom to transact and the economic freedom attached to it is entirely yours, and you can do whatever you want with it. Being able to sell it is only one level of that sort of economic freedom. Blockchain gaming, for instance, one of the biggest innovations in the space that really took off when we spoke last year was something called play to earn, right? Now, a lot of people get confused about play to earn sometimes because they think that the value that was generated from play to earn, did it come from thin air? It was just the tokens? Was it just communities? It's kind of a similar sort of, Ponzi scheme. But actually, what really happened was that the gaming ecosystems already generate a lot of value, and this was a way in which basically the data paradigm could be fairly valued. And let me explain that. The gaming industry is a $200+ billion industry right now. However, of those $200 billion, the platforms take 30%. Right? That's on top, right? So that's a lot of value that goes to Apple and Google and Steam, right? So that's number one. Number two, roughly $110 billion in app install revenue will be going to these same platforms this year alone. Last year was I think $96 billion. So it's still going up. Gaming generally is a pandemic and recession-proof industry because it's cheaper than going to the pub, for instance, right? You basically go play games at home, and it's also very social, and for this generation is actually perhaps the preferred way to socialize. So that means that of the $200 billion, something like 70% of that value goes straight into the platforms. How much of that money actually goes back into the gaming industry? And the short answer is almost zero. So that's the most extractive tax you can think of. So what Web3 gaming does is not the fact that, that you must make money from it. It's the fact that it unleashes and transparently opens up the financial ecosystem of the gaming world to everyone to see. So if you want to play the game for money, you can, but you don't have to. But you can play, but at least you know what it's worth. That means intermediaries can start coming in and providing better services or other services. So play to earn became possible, not because someone invented a system where you can basically sort of earn from the gameplay. I mean, happened actually because Yield Guild Games came in and created that system. It came from ownership first. The bedrock was I can own an Axie, and then I can rent that Axie to someone. And the gaming guild came about and said, oh, I can make a business out of this. And that is actually what happened. A network effect was created, and that is actually what made Axie big, not the fact that Axie entered the Philippine market, had a big marketing campaign, invented play to earn per se in and of itself. Actually, it was an invention that you could argue is maybe co-created by the people who were building the guild system because they saw that opportunity, because they had ownership. So ownership is the bedrock of that. After this, everyone else can create new services on top of ownership, right? Because I have ownership, I can sell it to you. Because I have ownership, I can maybe give it to someone for, a mortgage, for instance. Because I have ownership, I can apply it in 10 different games, right? And if you just observe everything you own physically, not even digitally, just physically, just count the number of network effects that are possible with the one kind of thing that you own. How many things can you do with the watch that you own, or the car that you own, or the shoe that you own, or even the clothes that you own? What number of services and what number of employment have been attached around just the fact that you own these things? And when you start counting them up, you go, wait a second, it's much more than just the purchase of that item. There's a whole ecosystem. The fact that you wear this great looking suit, employs a dry cleaner, or, has someone who makes the cotton, or employs a fashion designer, has a store somewhere in Oxford Street, like whatever that is. That entire ecosystem comes from just this simple principle that you can freely own this item and you can transact with it freely, and someone else can do business with you just because you own that. I think that is sort of really important. And, we don't teach that at school, right? People go and graduate from school and don't understand, from high school in this case, don't understand actually, why the world of economics works this way. We jump straight into democracy in democratic systems and maybe compare it against communism, but we don't actually go into the underlying economics around it. So are we surprised in that many of our young people are confused about it when they don't have that background? So I think we need to sort of educate people around this.
Yeah, I guess as Gordon Gekko would say, capitalism at its finest.
Right.
Which is kind of true. And what was it, Adam Smith that called it the invisible hand?
It is the invisible hand, indeed.
Right?
Yeah.
Where you grant this one thing that you own property, and then you watch what happens around it. You watch and then there's a market, there's a bid, there's an offer, and then this grows.
Capitalism is the reason why we have this innovation. Right? You're not going to have sort of this innovation. I mean, what made America and still makes America the most innovative country in the world is the fact that it still has sort of this incredible amount of innovation, disruptive innovation that you're able to do because there is an incentive to do so. And the problem is that because of the method in which capitalism is currently extracted, because of machine learning and AI and all that kind of stuff that's happened now, and technology in particular, the feeling is that capitalism has become extractive. And therefore, by engaging in capitalism, you must be doing something bad, right? You must be taking away from something from somewhere because you're not actually appropriately sharing it with the ecosystem, which unfortunately has become somewhat true. We've basically created generations of, managers and business operators that are thinking in terms of zero sum. And we used to have governments that were, able to enforce antitrust, for instance, right? And sort of, lock down on monopolies. There's a reason why antitrust was invented, because the people understood that actually when you have a monopoly, it becomes actually the opposite of capitalism in the sense that it becomes anti-competitive, right? So the spirit of competitiveness still needs to be there. So this is why we're so excited about Web3, because Web3 has a naturally anti-competitive nature because the data is now sitting in an open paradigm. So that means I can come to you and say, oh, you're worth $5,000 for Facebook. I know that because I can see it on the public ledger. Come to me and I'll pay you $4,000 instead. At least, you're able to bid the fair price. Maybe, and then you as a customer can have a choice. Oh, I'll go there for money. Or maybe you don't go for money. For instance, many people choose a job not because it makes the most money, but because it gives them the most satisfaction, because they want to be in this community, because they love it, right? So it's not, but it makes at least a decent living, and they choose that lifestyle over something else, right? It's, many of us don't choose something just because we make the most money out there. Again, if you come from a Wall Street culture, maybe that's your value system, but the vast majority of us actually don't live life this way and don't, want to live like that way. So I think that's another element. And when there's transparency, the efficiencies of the market come to play because someone else will come to you and make a much more reasonable offer, which is, by the way, what Web 1 did when it comes to resources, right? The reason why the farmer in China was able to get his fair price of rice It's because the internet told him that someone in America would pay, 100 times more than what he used to sell it to that middleman. So what does he do? He says, I want more, and because that's fair. And if that middleman was not going to give it to him, someone else said, well, I'll do it for you, because there is a capitalist outcome. There's an incentive to do so. So capitalism is really important. It's just that we have to rethink and reform capitalism in this new data age. And actually, I think Web3 is perfect for that.
It's fascinating how the blockchain and Web3 gives us a parallel look into kind of the things that we're doing. I don't know if you remember those old Star Trek episodes, like with William Shatner and Spock, and sometimes they'd be a parallel world and there'd be like them on the other side, but they were like slightly different, doing something different. And like Bitcoin kind of showed us this deflationary forward curve, and that there was a concept where, you have a fixed number of assets and you don't have money that you can print. And now, like you said, with the play to earn, we almost saw this ecosystem where you got to see like little, kind of in a petri dish of where property rights,
yes,
this organism grew. And again, a lot of people would say, well, that just happened in lockdown and these people in the Philippines. And you're like, no, take a step back. It's because there were property rights that all these ancillary businesses function on the back of it. And finally, some of the value of the gaming could go to the members of the community,
correct,
as opposed to in the Web3 world where it really is more like a socialist world there, where they take everything.
If you take, for instance, one of the most popular games in the world out there, like Fortnite, for instance, the assets that are really, they're not assets, but let's call it the virtual goods that people own are skins. If it was on chain, someone else, somewhere around the world, could literally open up Fortnite Fashion Week. And every person who was playing Fortnite could just simply go there with his skins and show it off, or maybe sell it or do whatever. And this could be an event, this could be an actual game, doesn't really matter. The freedom to do so for someone else. And the owner actually would be more delighted, right? It doesn't mean that every person has to do it. But I think many people will do it because it's just something cool. It's just something interesting. It's exciting. It's another way to experience it. Also, it makes the value and the utility of those same goods and assets in the original game more valuable and more interesting. So I think this is really the future of where that goes. If you think about the sort of ownership paradigm, when in a blockchain game, in the traditional app install economy, which as I said is like more than half of what people make in terms of the revenues in the gaming industry, instead of paying Apple and Google this value, which is over $100 billion this year, you end up giving it to the users because you incentivize them through ownership. It's like giving free land, for instance. Build on this land, or you can sell it. But the thing is, when you give someone free land, the chances of him actually maybe building something is far higher than when you give it to a platform or you give it to someone else who doesn't care about your land and he just sells it and goes away. And that's actually what's happening. In the advertising space, I'm advertising. Apple and Google happily take it and say, thank you for the promotional fee, the user you don't actually own anyway. And because you have to remarket it to the same user if you want to attach that, to attract that user. And as they take that money out, they will almost never put money back in the system. That's why Web3 gaming is so exciting, because the end user who receives the benefit of the virtual land or the virtual asset that he can have, the percentage of people who would invest more or invest into the ecosystem is far, far higher. It's a healthier community. First of all, to have this land, I need to be kind of interested. There might be some speculators, but it's not going to be 0% that basically not participate. It's going to be even 10 or 20% is a much healthier number than what we see today with the platforms. So real value is coming back into the ecosystem by actually giving to the very players who you want to help enjoy and build that ecosystem. Right, so the spirit of that is alive and well. And it's actually a capitalist incentive because I'm giving you something to come here and play this world. But of course, to make more value, to make it a better experience for you, to make it more fun, you have to invest. And investing doesn't mean money. Investing can mean time, because time is value as well.
Right. So I was in Dubai a couple weeks ago, had an amazing time, was kind of blown away by what's going on over there. I was also at GITEX, which is like the largest technology conference in the world.
I was there as well.
Oh, you were? Okay.
Yeah, I was speaking there as well. It was insane.
Yeah, I think I missed you just by a couple hours. And so I hosted a Web3 gaming panel, and there was a bunch of people on there in different spaces of Web3 gaming, and there was a guy from the esports world called Paul the Esports Prophet.
Okay.
And he got up there and he basically just stopped everybody and he said, look, you guys all talk about your Web3 games, but they're not fun to play. And he said, you can give me tokens, you can give me these NFTs, but if they're not fun to play, then you've missed the whole point, is what he said. And he said, also, when you give me tokens, it becomes a job, and that's not fun, is what he said. Now, he was very insistent, and he's known for these kind of mic drop moments, but you weren't there, so we didn't.
I would have loved to debate this.
I know, and that's why I want to ask you, because I think you would have been the one person, because most of the people up there didn't have a lot to say to fight back against that. And a lot of people ended up kind of agreeing with him, even though they were in the Web3 gaming space. So what would you say to that argument?
So first,
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.